series. Today, my friends, we start a series that we will be doing for the next probably year and a half, looking at the United States Constitution, the fundamental document that establishes how our country is going to be governed, and its extraordinary history, and the fact that it has been amended over time, over our now almost 250-year history, in a complex process. That means that it's not amended every time you turn around, but that it does have the possibility to grow and change as there are concerns of the American people. So we thought, in order to start this conversation, we should go to a scholar who is a scholar of the origin of the Constitution. And when we began to look around the country for the most distinguished person to do that, we were honored to find Professor Jack Rakove. Professor Rakove is now an emeritus professor in history, American studies, and even by courtesy law at Stanford University. His principal areas of research include the origins of the American Revolution and the Constitution, the political practice and theory of James Madison, and the role of historical knowledge in constitutional litigation. He's the author of multiple books, many of which he may reference, all of which we will give you a notice at the end so that you can find those books. The one which he won the Pulitzer Prize, Original Meanings, Politics, and Ideas in the Making of the Constitution, came out in 1996 and is still considered a foundational document. We are extremely honored to have with us today, to set the stage, to talk about the Constitution and its development, Professor Jack Rakove. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you so much, Jane and Sam. I want to start by making two preliminary remarks. The first is I need to apologize for the fact that I double booked myself, and so some of it for yesterday morning. So some of you have had to reschedule this talk for today. And second, I want to say that I have a real tall order of business to cover this morning. And having taught for better part of half a century, I know I'm not going to be able to reach all the points I want to make. And to reach as many as I can, I'm going to rely a lot more than I usually do on PowerPoint. Usually, as a teacher, I would use PowerPoint as much as a visual diversion for my students at Stanford as something I rely on. But in this case, we have so much ground to cover that I think it's better that I rely on these slideshows, because on the slideshow and in the other way, so that we can get all this material out. So without further ado, let's get started. I want to start by asking when Americans talk about a constitution, historically, what do we mean? So here I put up, what is the American definition of a constitution? It is a written document adopted at a fixed historical moment through processes of collective deliberation involving both its drafting and its ratification, which thereafter serves as supreme fundamental law, superior authority to all other forms of legal action, but open to revision by formal amendment and necessarily subject to interpretation and construction. Construction is a very fancy term that was used in the 18th and 19th century to identify the space wherein the Constitution was in effect silent, and later applicants, later appliers would have some leeway, some room for maneuver, some room for development. So we start with this definition. It has so many elements that we could probably spend the next hour unpacking each of them. The key point I want each of you to take away is to recognize that this was an innovation of a profound order of world historical significance. Every nation, in a sense, every polity has a working constitution in some sense of the term, something you could describe a mode of doing government. But the idea of framing and thinking and applying a constitution in these terms was, I very much believe, essentially an innovation of the American Revolutionary era. And that innovation and the way in which Americans started to think about it came about in 4 stages of constitutional debate. So if you're a historian, as Jane said, I have been, the origins of both the Revolution and the Constitution, it's important to think about the entire sequence of events that made this kind of historical development and this kind of historical innovation possible. Because issues raised at what we call T1, the first stage of the imperial controversy, were in a certain sense continue to be agitated at the very end of the 18th and turn of the 19th century. So there are basically 4 stages of debate, and we're going to really talk only about the middle 2 of them, but I think it's important for all of us to kind of conceptualize what this entire sweep of constitutional history was like. So we started with the great debate.
Dr. Rakove, can you just press slide? Can you press slideshow?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's right. Okay. We just, there, perfect. Oops, yeah. Thank you.
No, okay, now I need to get the next one up. Here we go, sorry. It worked on my screen, but I didn't realize it wasn't working on yours. Okay, so we have 4 stages. I'm still, because I've been emeritus, I'm a little rusty on some aspects of this whole, Zoom era. Anyhow, okay, so we have 4 stages of debate. The first one is, of course, the great debate over the Stamp Act and the Townsend duties in the mid-1760s, the first phase of the imperial crisis. And here, in a sense, the central problem is you have claims emanating from Great Britain about what is the authority that Parliament and the King have over the American colonies. The American colonies have contrary arguments of their own, depending upon their own history of self-government and their practices of representative government. So you get this very sophisticated debate in the really first phase of the revolutionary crisis. So that's T1. We're not going to say anything more about that. T2 essentially begins in the aftermath of the Boston Tea Party, when Parliament enacts the so-called coercive acts, or Americans call them the intolerable acts, that leads to the crisis of independence, which ends, of course, in July 1776, when the Americans declare independence. From our perspective, the key thing here is one aspect of declaring independence. The Americans also begin writing new constitutions of government. In a sense, this is kind of a great historical accident. It wasn't that they had the idea of, okay, we're going to be independent. Let's, we have this great opportunity of writing a constitution of government. In effect, they have to replace the old governments, which had big elements of royal authority embedded in them. So in effect, circumstances require the Americans to write new constitutions of government without thinking through all the implications of what they were doing. And at the same time, because they wanted to form an intercolonial or interstate union, and because they want to attract support from foreign powers, particularly France, they have to frame a national constitution of sorts, what we'll call the Articles of Confederation. So that's T2. We're going to come back and talk about that. T3, of course, is what concerns us most. A decade later, having won the Revolutionary War and then facing the kinds of political crises that came at the end of the war, the Americans have an unusual opportunity to rethink what it was they had done back in the mid-1770s, to go back and re-examine those first constitutions, including the Articles of Confederation they drafted at the moment of independence, and to see what lessons they could draw from that experience. And here the person I rely on is the guy I sometimes call, identifies as my scholarly alter ego, namely James Madison, since I've spent the better half century, plus or minus, thinking about Madison's politics. And he writes a famous document we'll look at briefly called The Vices of the Political System of the United States, which represented his own working paper for how to proceed with the agenda of the Constitutional Convention. And then finally, the phase that interests us next is, or at least what we won't talk about today, but it's important for us to know, and particularly at this moment in historical time when our whole constitutional system is coming under the gravest threats it's faced probably since 1861, the whole question of how you have a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another in a highly mobilized, actually very virulent political environment. That was the great challenge that kind of closes out this great constitutional experiment of the late 18th century. And we don't have time to talk about that today, but as citizens, all of us should be mindful of this in the future. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what I want to call American Federalism 1.0. That's to say, the understanding of the nature of the federal union as it was embodied in the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were basically drafted in 1776, 1777. Congress, it was a difficult task. The Continental Congress was hung up over a set of issues that it found to be pretty intractable. One was the question of Western lands. Would the national government get jurisdiction over the Trans-Appalachian lands, particularly north of the Ohio River? One was the question of an equal state vote. Should there be an equal state vote in the Continental Congress? And the third, a kind of tricky one, was the question of how would you apportion expenses across the states, as the war went forward. Congress could not reach agreement on these issues, so it had periodic debates over the Articles, starting in the summer of 1776 and again the spring of 1777. And then finally, after the Great American Victory at Saratoga, when General Burgoyne's army had to surrender, the Americans realized now is the moment they'll conclude a treaty with France, or they'll have the potential for concluding a treaty of alliance with France. And to demonstrate to the French that we were up to the task, it would be better to complete a confederation. So the Americans just had to impose some solution on this problem. So what this slide tries to demonstrate, and it's not comprehensive, but it tries to identify some of the leading figures, some of the leading elements of what I call American Federalism 1.0. So each state will have, you solve the voting problem, each state will have a single vote in a unicameral kind of Congress. It won't be bicameral, it's a single chamber assembly. Delegates would actually vote as individuals, but, and you could have roll call votes in which individual votes would be recorded, but the formal vote would depend upon how a delegation divided. So that's point number one. Point number two, in some ways the most important point of all, is that Congress had no legislative authority over American citizens as such. The basic way in which the federal system operated, even before the Articles of Confederation were finally ratified, which actually did not take place until 1781, was that Congress would adopt resolutions, recommendations, and requisitions that the states were expected to enforce. This is not a John C. Calhoun version of federalism, where the states have an independent authority to deny or challenge or ignore federal measures. The basic understanding is Congress really lacks the institutional apparatus to know how to apply its policies, its decisions across the 13 disparate states. So it expects the states to figure out the best way legislatively to enforce the measures it's recommending, or the requisitions, meaning the demands for money or munitions or manpower it's sending out. So the states have that authority to implement, but it's not so much discretionary. It's discretionary in the sense that they have to figure out the best way to do it. Third, Congress controls war and foreign relations, while the states retain sovereignty over their internal police. It's important to note that at the very beginning, Americans were operating under a theory of divided sovereignty, meaning there were some of the sovereign powers of government that belonged to the national level, war and foreign affairs. And internal police, really meaning all matters of internal governance, including actually how you might respond to a pandemic, would belong to the states. Congress had no independent source of revenue. It had no power to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. And finally, strategically an important point, Congress, the Articles of Confederation had to be approved, and if they had to be amended, it had to take place with the consent of all 13 state legislatures. Now, at this point, I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to bring myself back on screen, if this works. I hope that's what's happening. So just I want to say something briefly about the problems that arose with the Articles of Confederation between the mid-1770s and into the mid-1780s. So as I said, the Articles went out to the states in November 1777. They weren't finally ratified until the winter of 1781. The last holdout was the state of Maryland. Maryland was holding out mostly because it wanted to, mostly over the Western lands issues. I won't get into the politics of that. It's what falls on what in California we call the muy complicado side of things. But the key thing is, by the time the Articles were ratified and finally took effect on March 1st, 1781, many observers, and particularly Alexander Hamilton, who was still an aide-de-camp to George Washington in the Army, and James Madison, who had entered Congress in March 1780, and never went home for 3.5 years until he was term limited out in the fall of 1783. They were already convinced the articles as drafted were deficient. And so as soon as the articles were ratified, schemes began. Schemes were launched to amend the articles and enlarge the authority of Congress. 1781, Congress sent out what was called the impost amendment. The idea, an impost being a duty on foreign imports, the idea being that Congress should have at least some independent sources of revenue, not that they provide enough funding to take care of the war itself, but so that Congress could approach potential foreign creditors to kind of invest in the American cause with the assurance that there would be some payment down the road. The first impost failed because the state of Rhode Island, which is I like to say, if Rhode Island fell into the ocean, who would know in the other states? Rhode Island blocked it and rejected them. The second set of amendments went out in April 1783. This was the result of a more comprehensive set of deliberations over over Congress's continuing financial needs. Congress had appointed Robert Morris, a distinguished, very wealthy Philadelphia merchant, as its superintendent of finance. Morris had drafted a comprehensive program of financial reform. Congress fiddled with it, revised it in critical ways. Madison actually played a critical role in working out the final versions. So Congress sent another set of financial amendments out to the states in April 1783. And then a year later, Congress sent two more amendments relating to the regulation of foreign commerce out to the states. None of these amendments succeeded. They all fell short of the requirement for unanimous ratification. And at this point, I think I'm going to go back to the screen and put my buddy James Madison up here. The guy who I think I follow most closely in the period after this was Madison. And the reason I do that is because Madison became, to my way of thinking, the most active player, the most active strategist, and in a certain sense, the most creative thinker in terms of the agenda of constitutional reform that led us to the Federal Constitutional Convention in 1787. So let me say something about Madison's career. I have a great short biography of him, which is going out of print, which I'm going to try to find a new publisher of, and I've written a book about another kind of intellectual biography of him. And he figures prominently in my book, Original Meaning. So, I spend most of my working days one way or another still thinking about Madison. This is one of my two favorite portraits of Madison. It's the one done by Charles Wilson Peale, 1792. So he's a bit older here than he was at the time when, in the mid 70s, when he became our greatest constitutional statesman. So Madison, was born in Virginia. I just left the board of his plantation, Montpelier, which is just outside Orange. Any of you visit Monticello down the road in Charlottesville should make sure to go Montpelier as well. It's a great tour. You have a lot more time inside the house in Montpelier than you do at Monticello. So Madison was educated at the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton. He went back to Virginia. He was kind of an aimless young man, bit of a hypochondriac. Actually had some bouts with epilepsy, it seems. He served, but he was elected to the 5th Provincial Convention in the spring of 1776, when he played a modest role in drafting the first Virginia convention. He was defeated for election to the first, he served in the first Virginia Assembly, where he first met Thomas Jefferson. He was defeated for re-election to the second, to the Virginia Assembly that convened in the fall of in 1777, but he was then elected to the Council of State, which was kind of an advisory body to Governor Patrick Henry, and then later to Thomas Jefferson. In March 1780, he was elected to the Continental Congress, and as I said before, he went off there. It was the worst winter in American history, much worse than the Valley Forge winter, in fact. But he made it. He made his way to Philadelphia. He served 3.5 years there without going home once, which is highly unusual for any member of the Continental Congress. But then, as I said, he was term limited out of office under the Articles. in the fall of 1783, he went back to Virginia, where he served 3 successive terms in the Virginia legislature. He became the dominant figure in the legislature, and he began to, think seriously about an agenda of constitutional reform. And then in 1787, he was re-eligible to go back to the Continental Congress, and so he began a second term of service on the eve of the Constitutional Convention. For our perspective, the critical thing to know here is that when Madison was serving the Virginia legislature back in January 1786, just as the session of that legislature was about to adjourn sine die without a further date, it wasn't Madison's desire, but the first John Tyler, the father of the later President John Tyler, introduced a resolution for Virginia to call a general, kind of a special convention to discuss issues of commerce. Remember there are a couple of amendments on the commercial powers were circulating out there. They had not been approved or, by the other states. They could not, overcome that barrier of universal ratification. Madison was not crazy about this idea. But in the months to come, when he was elected to Virginia's delegation to go to, they finally decided that let's go to Annapolis. And B, he decided that at this point, any further effort to reform the Articles of Confederation was doomed to failure because Congress itself had grown so discredited in the public esteem, in its public perception, that some other method had to be tried. Now, there was no other method available under the Articles of Confederation. The only way to amend the Constitution was to have the Continental Congress propose an amendment. You would need 9 states to propose it, to have all 13 state legislatures agree to ratify it. But Madison at this point, was becoming more of a political gambler. He'd been replaced in Virginia delegation by James Monroe, whose plantation is actually, some of you may know, is actually pretty close to Monticello, which is really just down the road. And he and Monroe had an active correspondence, and another set of proposed amendments was cooking in the Continental Congress. Madison in effect says no. We should sit on those now. I mean, the past amendments haven't worked. Let's try a different procedure. So he went off to Annapolis. Actually, they met at Mann's Tavern. I have a photograph of myself outside the site of where Mann's Tavern was. Alexander Hamilton was there. John Dickinson, who'd been the main author originally, the Articles of Confederation, was there. Abraham Clark from New Jersey, Edmund Randolph from Virginia. It was a small group, distinguished. Problem was, although 8 states had agreed to send delegations, only 5 states showed up. So it may have been a big ploy on their part. I tend to think it was more a desperate maneuver. They felt they didn't have enough delegates to act on their agenda on the one hand, but they didn't want to adjourn without doing anything on the other. So they issued a call for a general convention to meet at Philadelphia in May 1787. It was very much a gamble on their part, but they felt they'd run out of options. They felt the framework of reform under the Articles was no longer effective. So they had to try to do something new. So it was at this point, I think, that Madison took the initiative. He made his way back to Virginia. Now, why is this not?
Professor, you may need to click there.
Here we go. Is this working?
Yes, sir. Okay.
So this is, so Madison at this point was engaged in a course of study. This is the first page. This comes from Madison, who was, I wrote many years ago that in our age, Madison coming out of Princeton would have been a natural candidate for graduate school. Some of my grad students took offense to that, but this is actually the first page. We have two sets of notes of ancient and modern confederacies. The document is very small. I actually saw this document at Madison's 250th birthday in the Library of Congress in the company of Justice Scalia and Mrs. Scalia. We were talking and looking at the exhibit. So Madison set himself the task of studying what had gone wrong with ancient confederacies, and then when he went back to Philadelphia, he drafted the document known as The Vices of the Political System of the United States. I'm just gonna, you guys can't read it. I just want you to look at it. We're just going to quickly scroll our way through it. I think this is one of the most fabulous documents in the history of American political thinking. It's the antecedent for example, for Federalist 10, which is kind of Madison's greatest, best known constitutional text. The key thing to realize is this is a document Madison wrote for himself, where he tries to summarize everything he thought was wrong with the federal constitution. And as you scroll your way through it, you can see, he leaves spaces, he lines things out, he makes corrections. There are places where he could add further thoughts. There's now a debate among scholars as to, I think he wrote most of this in New York City, which was then the capital, in April 77. But Mary Bilder of Boston College, who wrote a great book called Madison's Hand, about Madison's notes of debate from the Philadelphia Convention, thinks actually Madison added the final most important parts only when he got to the Philadelphia Convention. They actually starts down here where it says lower left-hand corner, multiplicity of laws in the several states, and then here's where the document ends. And so I just think it's a key document. Now, so what were the vices of the political system of the United States that created the agenda for constitutional reform that Madison wanted to pursue? And so what this is designed to do is to lay out the basic agenda for reform that Madison worked out as he set himself the agenda of trying to decide what kinds of issues should the Constitutional Convention confront. God will, it would take me another 2 hours to go through all this stuff adequately, but these are essential points that I want all of you to kind of think about and grasp. And some of you, I think, will, I think this will be news to many of you. Okay, the first and to some extent the most important of these comes out of actually item 7 of the vices. By the way, you can type in vices of the United States and you'll get different hits if you want to go back and read it. So this actually comes from item 7, which I actually think in some ways is the most important of all, where Madison went back to what I call the Federalism 1.1 model, where he tries to, where it says that the way in which the system is going to work is, federal system is going to work is Congress will recommend and the states will implement. In Madison, thinking both historically, but also in a way that I've written about this extensively, actually has a powerfully game theoretic dimension. Says, when you think about this form of implementing national decisions, it's never going to work. It's never going to produce the system we're going to rely on. Federalism 1.0, as we're calling it, is a system that, if we rely on it, will never fail to render federal measures abortive, meaning it's just not going to work. The states are never going to universally comply with this, that they're going to be jealous of one another, et cetera, et cetera. So we need a different system. So what should a new system of national government look like? Well, we need to empower the national government to enact, execute, and adjudicate its own laws. And those laws will be directed not to the participating members of the state of the Confederation, that's to say, not to the 13 quasi-sovereign states. Laws will bind the citizens themselves, who have to be subject to the usual sets of sanctions and punishments, to which we're subordinated when we fail to obey the laws. Now, because the new national government that Madison is conceiving will act legally, it has to enact by it has to work by legislation, by laws in the proper sense of the term, because we're all Republicans. Its political institutions should represent the people proportionally. In other words, we also, there are really two implications. One is because Americans, at least outside of the state of Pennsylvania, believe that legislature should be bicameral, we have to replace the unicameral Continental Congress with a bicameral National Congress. And we should have some proportional rules of representation in both houses of Congress, in what will become, of course, both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And this, of course, is where, in the end, we wind up with equal state vote, which Madison thought then, and I believe now, is a terrible disaster. And we also wind up with the 3/5 clause as a form of sexual accommodation. But the key thing here is the big hang-up in the first 6 weeks of the convention is, would we have proportional representation in both houses of Congress? That's necessary if Congress is going to act legally. Okay. And the key thing here that I want you to think about is that once that becomes the case, once you start thinking about what is the proper framework for the national government to act legally in this sense, then you can start reflecting on the different kinds of institutions the Americans had set up at the state level back in 1776. So in effect, Federalism 2.0 also becomes Republicanism 2.0. And that's what makes, the second phase of debate in the late 1780s such a rich body of material to analyze, because it's a conscious reflection and reconsideration on what was it we had done 10 years earlier. And because Madison, as a young man, had been part of that process, as I said, had served at the 5th Virginia Provincial Convention, which had drafted Virginia's Constitution. Madison remembered what it had been like, not just by reading about it, the way he'd read about ancient modern confederacies, but because he'd been there and he'd done that. And he had a sense of the excitement of what that process had been like. Okay, so that's a big takeaway for everybody out there. Then three further points. Since we knew the whole system of ratification on the Articles had not worked, and we knew that actually one state, Rhode Island, was not had refused to attend the Constitutional Convention at all, we're going to abandon the rules of amendment adopted under the Articles of Confederation. They're just not feasible. This is a revolutionary moment of sorts. We're going to be more creative. So, we're not going to require unanimous state approval. You can opt in, you can opt out. And next point. Now, this is a critical one. We're not going to submit the Constitution to the state legislatures. I used to tell my Stanford students, since I know you all can translate Latin, the phrase that follows needs no translation, but just to be on the safe side here. So there's a well-known rule of legal construction. It says, leges posteriores priores contrarias abrogant, meaning later laws contradicting earlier laws abrogate them. What this actually means is one legislature cannot bind a later legislature. And because the Articles of Confederation had been approved by the state legislatures, Madison argued, I think correctly, that the state legislatures remained free to violate the Articles of Confederation if they so wished. But now flip that proposition around. If you want to, and go back to my original working definition, the American working definition of Constitution, if you want a Constitution to be supreme fundamental law, you need to have it, A, framed by a convention specially called for that purpose, and B, ratified by some authority other than the state legislatures. So you come up with the idea of having popularly elected ratification conventions, actually with a wider suffrage, more open to popular approval than the state legislatures were at the time. You could say in one sense this was just a legal fiction, but it did some necessary work in that sense. And then finally, the last point I'm going to make here, and I won't have much time to elaborate this, but one of Madison's high on Madison's list of priorities for the convention, beyond the notion of proportional representation in both houses, was the idea that it would be essential to give the national government a negative, we'd say a veto, but they would say a negative on state laws, meaning that every, in theory, in its most expansive form, every law the state legislatures passed would be subject to congressional review. And there would be two purposes to the negative. One would be to protect the national government against the states, should the states try to interfere with national laws. If you want a great historical example, think about the famous bank case of 1819, McCulloch versus Maryland, would fit that scenario very well. Or you can think, of course, like nullification in 1832. But secondly, and more originally, Madison also felt the negative would be essential to protect minorities, that's the minorities of citizens within the states, against unjust laws enacted against them. Okay, so that's my review. Now I want to say what big questions remain, and this is, I know what Jane and the sponsor of this talk really wanted to make sure I answered. So I think I could do this in about 5 to 10 minutes. Certainly no more than 10. Jane or whoever's coordinating, if you need to intervene, let me know. My feelings won't be hurt if you cut me short. So here's some big questions that all of us need to think about. First off, why did the Constitution omit a Bill of Rights? To answer that question satisfactorily, and we raise that question because we know the big Well, it's my fourth question. So let's just put the question. Why did the Constitution admit a Bill of Rights? The question was discussed for about 10 minutes in mid-August 1787, about 3 or 4 weeks before the adjournment of the convention. To answer that question, to think about it historically, we have to ask the further question. We have to ask, if we know that the framers admitted it, to know why they did it, there's the further question you have to ask is, what function were bills of rights at that time thought to serve? Were they designed simply to state a set of principles that everyone morally ought to pursue? Or were they established a set of entrenched legal rules that institutions were obliged, shall enforce? And the key point here, this is a kind of republicanism 1.0 versus republicanism 2.0 question, is bills of rights had accompanied a number of the state constitutions adopted back in the mid-1770s. But they typically said ought rather than shall, and they were, except for Pennsylvania in 1776 and Massachusetts in 1780, they were separate documents. They weren't actually entrenched, incorporated in the Constitution. They were meant to serve more as guidelines to how Republican government ought to operate than as legal commands. So there's a significant shift, and Madison embodies this. There was a significant shift in how Americans thought about the function of bills of rights between 1776 and 1787. Third point, this is a very Madisonian point. Where are the real threats to rights most likely to arise? Historically, you would have said, let's say before 1776, you'd say the real danger to rights is likely to rise from the concentrated power of the state, and particularly actually from the executive branch, from the monarchy. It was the legislature, in kind of Anglo-American thinking before 1776, it was the legislature, parliament, or the colonial assemblies that was supposed to protect the rights of the citizens against the arbitrary rule of royal authority. Of course, we get rid of royal authority in 1776, the legislature becomes the dominant branch. So that shifts the equation of this. Secondly, in a federal system, which level of government is going to be more dangerous? Do we have more to worry about from the national government or from the states? And third, Madison's answers will, of course, be the states. What's the real source of the danger in the states? Does it arise from the corrupt tendencies of the legislators or the legislature, or does it arise from the people themselves? So this is it's an important question when you ask. Where are real threats to rights most likely to rise? If you want to understand the omission of the Bill of Rights, we have to focus on this question. And then finally, the great historical question, was there a tacit bargain to add a Bill of Rights? Did that become the key to the ratification of the Constitution? Okay, now, since I'm down to a handful of minutes, I'm going to offer Madison's answers to this. And there's just, again, for the scholars among you, if you wanted to understand Madison's logic, again, there's 2 documents. You can just Google them, or go to the Founders Constitution website. There are 2 essential Madison letters. One is his letter, not mentioned here, his letter to Jefferson of October 24th, 1787, where he defends at some length the negative on state laws. And then a second letter of October 17, 1788, where Madison explains why he's now willing to agree that a Bill of Rights should be added to the Constitution, but he lays out the deeper rationale for his misgivings about it. And Madison sometimes, Madison was a kind of, was fond of drawing distinctions and teasing out his thoughts. I mean, Jefferson, he didn't write like Thomas Jefferson or Tom Paine. He was a much more nuanced writer. But sometimes he distilled some of his key thoughts in single sentences. And this is one of them. So writing to Jefferson, Jefferson, of course, at this time is our Minister of France, he answers that key question. Where does the real danger rise? So Madison wants to argue first that the real danger arises within the states, not from the national government, but second, and more important, in our governments, the real power lies in the majority of the community. And the evasion of private rights is chiefly to be apprehended, not from acts of government contrary to the sense of its constituents, but from acts in which the government is the mere instrument of the major number of the constituents. This is a reformulation of the whole problem of rights. To say the real danger in a republic comes not from the arbitrary will of the people we elect to be our rulers or our governors. It really comes from the prejudices and the biases and the interests that circulate in the community at large. And so then secondly, so that, Madison says, okay, I'm going to carry this logic far enough to say, on this basis, I think a Bill of Rights will do some good, but that doesn't fully answer the question, how will a Bill of Rights function? So he then goes on in the same letter to offer two further thoughts. He asks us the question. So I like to tell my students I've written, when Madison asks a question, it's not really rhetorical, it's really analytical. He's trying to push the issue, he's trying to push his own thinking. So he says, what use then, and maybe asking, a Bill of Rights serve in popular governments? So he gives us two answers. He says, first, the political truths declared in that solemn manner acquire by degrees the character of fundamental maxims of free government. And as they become incorporated in the national sentiment, counteract the impulses of interest and passion. What Madison is saying here is we're not thinking of Bill of Rights, first and foremost, as legally enforceable mechanisms. The way they're going to work is we're going to incorporate the sentiments and the principles they express so that they will counteract our own worst impulses. In other words, we're not going to think about what makes them legally enforceable. We're going to think about them. We're going to teach them to your children when thou goest out and when thou comest back. I'm thinking actually a famous passage from the Old Testament. And they will be a brake on civic behavior. And then secondly, there may be occasions, though Madison thinks that the real danger lies in popular majorities rather than what he calls usurped acts of the government. Look at number 2. There may be occasions in which the evil may spring from the latter sources, and on such a Bill of Rights will be a good ground for appeal to the sense of community. This is not a legalist solution. And actually, if you follow this correspondence out, Jefferson replies to this letter by saying, look, if you have a Bill of Rights, judges will enforce it. Which was not a point that Madison, was quick to seize on. Madison picks up on Jefferson's thought and accepts that point. But Madison wasn't sure the judiciary would be powerful enough to resist popular passions. So, finally, and my two last points. What was the real deal that Madison sought in promoting the Bill of Rights? So he had, I think, two political purposes, and then I'm going to stop, and so I'll finish at a quarter of, and I'll leave us 15 minutes. So first off, Madison, there were two political goals that Madison had in mind when he thought about the whole question of whether or not they had a Bill of Rights. So when he reached that decision in 1788 in the course of ratification conventions, and when he pursued it in 1789 over the qualms and reservations of his fellow members of the First Federal Congress, Madison's second political goal was to reassure modern anti-federalists. The anti-federalists said we need a Bill of Rights, a constitution without it is defective. Even though Madison still didn't think a Bill of Rights was all that important, would be all that useful. If you adopted one early on, you would convince modern anti-federalists that the Federalists were not plotting to impose a tyranny on the American people. It would be, a kind of important concession to public opinion. It may not have been legally necessary or constitution required, but it would be good. But the key thing to realize here involves actually going back to the situation 1787, 1788. Madison's resistance to amendments in general, going back to the period from September 1787 to the summer of 1788, was he wanted to make sure that the state conventions would ratify the Constitution first, without insisting that the amendments they sought and that they were recommending would have to be approved before they would give their consent. Madison did not want to have a second convention meet or have the state legislatures be allowed to send their delegations back to a second convention. They might alter the delegations. They might give their second delegations instructions about how to proceed. That would prevent the convention from having further agreement. So Madison here is really a constitutional statesman. He says the first imperative is we have to get the Constitution in its entirety ratified. Then we can think about amending it, but we can't make the ratification process subject to prior amendments. We need to get the damn thing ratified in its entirety first, and then we can discuss amendments. And so now, as we say out on the West Coast, that's a wrap. And it is a quarter of, or actually 14 minutes of. So Whatever questions you have that I can answer as expeditiously as possible, let them rip. And if we don't have time, if individuals want to email me, I'm just Rakove, R-A-K-O-V-E at stanford.edu. And I'd be happy to, if we don't have time to get to the things you want to know, feel free to write me.
Well, Professor Rakove, you have been so generous with your time. And I feel as if we have just had a graduate school course in less than an hour. And so you've stepped up to the challenge. We have a couple of questions from our listeners. One of them is, given Madison's opinion that the danger to rights would arise from the states and not the federal government,
right,
why do you think the Bill of Rights was written as a limitation of powers on the federal government rather than on the states?
Well, actually, so this the answer here is Madison's ideal solution was to give the national government a negative on state laws, both as a self-defensive measure, but also to deal with the problem he worked out with Jefferson, or he's trying to explain to Jefferson. Now, the key thing here is, if you guys know the argument of Federalist 10, or about Madison material. So Madison's political thinking pivots around the problem. Where are what he calls factious majorities, majorities acting from improper purposes? Where are they most likely to appear, to be able to coalesce? And if you know the argument of Federalist 10, the whole argument is the larger the entity, the more complex and diverse the society. Well, my chair has a habit of sinking on me. Sorry. Okay. So, the larger the society, the more difficult it will be for the wrong kinds of majorities to form. The smaller the society, take Rhode Island, which actually serves as a kind of famous bête noire in this period. The smaller the society, the easier it will be for factious majorities, meaning majorities that will neither conform to the public good nor respect private rights. The easier it will be for those majorities to form. So it's a kind of Federalist 10, which of course is kind of the locus classicus of American constitutional theory. It's basically an essay in comparative politics. And essentially what it says is, we have two levels of government. Which one is more dangerous? If the real power lies among the people themselves, as Madison would later say, where will the people find it easier to act in a fascist fashion? I think Madison's logic continues to work. If we think about the political situation we face today, if you think about, and this will be a red state, blue state kind of arguments, and I'm sure your audience, probably is not uniformly blue or uniformly red. So I may offend some of you, but the kind of legislation that's flourishing in the small states, voter suppression laws, or attempts to suppress minority votes, or think classically in American history, think about Jim Crow segregation, et cetera. It seems to me Madison's logic continues to work.
And one of the questions came up, first we have a news for you. One of your father's students from UIC is watching today, smiling and just so proud of you. But the question we have is, you mentioned term limits briefly under the Articles of Confederation.
Articles of Confederation, yeah.
And were they discussed at all in the constitutional process for the convention?
Yeah, well, effectively, because they disappear. Under the Articles, you could serve 3 years out of 6. Until the Articles are ratified, it didn't matter. It didn't matter anyhow, because very few. My first book is the history of the Continental Congress. Very few individuals wanted to serve long terms there. And most members, when they went, they go for 4 months, they go for 6 months. Congress is always shifting. Some people serve significantly. Samuel Adams went for a long time, for example. Madison was kind of unique. He served 3.5 years without going home once. But he was, Patrick Henry was term limited out of being the governor of Virginia. Similar rule, you could serve 3 years out of 6. Articles of Confederation had the same rule. They removed that from the Constitution. So there are no term limits. And if you know the term, the Thornton is a term limits versus Thornton. I think it's a 1992 case on this. against the issue. Jane, there's a key point that has to be made here, though, is that I think Madison wanted, and other Federalists thought it would, thought it would be good for Congress to, for people to pursue active political careers, to take it up not just as an avocation, but as a profession. But Madison expected, in fact, correctly, that members of Congress would continue to come and go. I mean, who would want to go to Washington in the 19th century? The British thought of it as a hardship post, and so on. The mean term of service in the U.S. House of Representatives down to 1890s was 3 years, meaning the vast majority of members served only 1 or 2 terms. Members of the House served only 1 or 2 terms. So they wanted to make service in Congress more attractive, so they got rid of the term limits idea. It wasn't a real problem they had to solve, though.
And I'm trying to sort of pull together the questions. One of the questions is about what rights did Madison think needed to be protected? Was it, at the time there was the abuses of the crown, and what was that debate about rights?
Well, I think, well, first, everyone believed in habeas corpus, but habeas corpus is actually incorporated in terms of legal protections of individuals. That's actually incorporated in the main text of the Constitution. Madison's political thinking. I've written, one of my recent books is on the history of the free exercise of religion. I mean, a lot of Madison's political thinking begins with the religion question. I mean, Madison was deeply committed to the principle not just of religious toleration, but of the free exercise of religion. And so I think, since you can generalize that to, the way Jefferson and Madison both were inclined to do, to free expression of thought more generally, to a kind of marketplace of ideas in a much more open fashion. Then if you go back, if you look at the state bills of rights, which again are kind of, they're going back to 1776 or what they recommend, a lot of the common law protections, the things we find in particularly the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th Amendments, mattered a lot. The right to counsel, the right to trial by jury, jury of one's peers, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, all those conventional common law notions to be fully constitutionalized was part of the equation. In thinking about this, though, Madison, I think, go back to what I said earlier about the difference between ought and shall. Madison said, if we're going to have a Bill of Rights, should not just be a set of principles. It should really be a set of legal commands. And that's why Madison wanted to have these common law protections incorporated in the specific part, or we use the term interwoven in the specific part of the Constitution where they would seem most relevant. And then when you get to the first Federal Congress and they're actively debating the amendments, which Madison called the nauseous project of amendments, which Madison introduced, Roger Sherman, who'd also, a real political veteran, says, no, we can't amend the original text. We have to add these amendments as additional articles. Otherwise, there would have been no Bill of Rights per se. The main text of the Constitution would have been altered. And Roger Sherman says, no, we can't. We really shouldn't mess, for whatever reason, we shouldn't mess with the text that way. It's kind of interesting debate about the legal efficacy of, the textual placement of the articles you want to protect.
Okay, we've got 2 more. Each of which could create an entire lecture, but let's try to,
particularly if I'm doing it.
Well, it's fascinating. One is there's a discussion about the Republican form of government.
This is what David Skaggs is concerned.
David Skaggs is concerned.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us a real high level, and then I'm going to give you the final question?
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's there in the vices. I mean, it's one of Madison's items in the vices of the political system. And there were multiple things he's thinking about. One, I mean, as a general principle, Madison says there may be occasions. We can think about this in terms of what's been going on in our own republic. Let's go back to January 6th. There may be occasions where you have violent upheavals against the legal authority of the state. I mean, they would have thought about Shays' Rebellion. Or you may have ambitious individuals who are just trying to seize power. The Americans were familiar with the history of republics, ancient and modern. Go back to Madison's notes on ancient and modern confederacies. So may have those occasions. Madison also worried, I think, about slave rebellions. I mean, that's mentioned there as well. And so under the Articles, when Shays' Rebellion took place, the Continental Congress lacked the authority to just kind of simply send the army in, to kind of assist the state of Massachusetts in putting down a revolt of debtor farmers. Then of course, and then there is a larger principle. It's the Republican Guarantee Clause it's one of those empty vessels of American constitutionalism. We talk about it a lot, but we don't know how to apply it. What does it mean to have a Republican government? Does the Constitution create some kind of federal standard whereby we can say that some governments are acting in a way that would defy Republican principles? Madison privately in 1792, Madison, as a little passover, Madison says, where slavery exists, you cannot really have a republic. Wherever you have a system of wherever the social system is based on slavery, in effect, you have an aristocracy in the traditional sense of the term. You have a legally debilitated, oppressed class. But of course, he doesn't want to talk about slavery in public if he can avoid doing it. So it's a powerful private thought that he doesn't expand on. The question of Republican form, it comes up in a lot of the anti-slavery debates, both before the Civil War and then also after. I mean, post-1865 in the context of Reconstruction. But it's one of those clauses, a bit like the Ninth Amendment. It represents a kind of tantalizing, potentially provocative principle, but it's very hard to know how you would implement it, particularly in a federal system.
And so, Professor, final question, and it kind of flows from what we've just been talking about when you talked about what were the founders thinking about. Can you give us an understanding of, we keep hearing there's a constitutional crisis. This is a constitutional crisis. What, in your mind, constitutes a constitutional crisis? And do you see any examples today that are?
Yeah, look, my next book is a political history of the Constitution. Originally, it's going to end it in 2016 and then 2020 and then now 2024. And when I write that book, as I like to tell people, I no longer know what its conclusion is. Usually when you write a book, you like to say, if you're an 18th century historian, you don't know how a book's going to end until you write the last page and you say, et voila, that's it. But usually you know what the conclusion is. I no longer know what the conclusion is. So go back to that last point that I made when I had, the 4 phases. So what's at stake in our constitutional system today? We no longer know if we believe in a peaceful transfer of power. What was January 6th about? If you apply Occam's razor, which I find to be a very, and I actually applied to my religious book. I actually came up with the idea of Madison's razor of religious freedom. If you apply Occam's razor to our current situation, what was January 6th about? The most convincing explanation, I think the only plausible one, it was an attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. I mean, how else are we going to interpret the former guy's actions and of those around him? And what else was being done? So that that fourth point that Americans, like, we all look back, historians look back to 1801 with that in mind, because they were mobilizing the militia, and there was discussions about whether militia from Republican states would march on Washington, to make sure that Jefferson took power. So we're back at that situation, and that's why that's why I worry. We all should worry.
Professor Rakove, you have given us so much in-depth understanding and ways to think about it. I'm sure now that our readers are anxious to read more of your books. And we're honored to have Professor Rakove with us today, such a prolific author. And we will send you all an email that gives you a link to this recording, but also information about his books, the Pulitzer book, Original Meanings, Politics and Ideas in the Making of the Constitution, the annotated United States Constitution and Declaration of Independence, which sets a historical context for all of this work. His most recent book that he just referred to, Beyond Belief, Beyond Conscience, The Radical Significance of the Free Exercise of Religion, all are available. And that really sets us up for our conversation about our next webinar. On April 14th, we start with the amendments, and we will have Steve Waldman, who will discuss his latest book, Founding Faith, Providence, Politics, and the Birth of Religious Freedom in America, as we begin the First Amendment. We hope you'll join with us as we explore the Constitution and its amendment, and we hope you will join us in thanking Professor Rakove for his time, his talent. We appreciate the fact that even though you retired before teaching became Zoom, you managed to master it, and we really appreciate that. We also want to give you something to look forward to a little further ahead. On April 26th at 10:30 in the morning, we're going to have a hybrid event. That means that some people will come in person and some will be able to watch it online, where we are going to commemorate Ulysses S. Grant. It's his bicentennial, where we will be looking at the centennial of the Grant Memorial on the Capitol grounds. And we will be joined by Senator Roy Blunt, the architect of the Capitol, Brett Blanton, and New York Times bestselling author, Ronald White. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you so much for being with us. Remember, we appreciate your support. The United States Capitol Historical Society is a nonprofit organization. We're able to bring these to you only because of the gifts of our members and friends. Thank you for your contributions. We're glad you're with us. We look forward to seeing you soon. Be well. Goodbye.